The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the floorboards of her small hut, in the threadbare wool of her blanket, and deep in the marrow of her bones. Elena had been cast out into the northern wilderness for the crime of being empty, barren. A word her stepmother, Ilyana, had spat like a curse. A word that had sealed her fate and sent her here to die quietly, out of sight. She was a healer, or had been. She knew the herbs that soothed a fever, the poultices that drew infection, the teas that eased a troubled mind. But she could not conjure life where there was none. In a world that valued legacy and bloodlines above all, her womb was a barren field, and she was the worthless farmer who tended it. So she lived alone, at the edge of the world, with the ghosts of children she would never hold. Sometimes, the ghosts felt real. A flash of a small hand reaching for hers, the echo of a laugh on the wind that was too clear to be just the breeze. They were sharp, painful jolts that left her dizzy and nauseous. She'd learned to brace for them, these waking dreams that felt like memories of a future she was denied. She thought it was madness, a symptom of her grief, the price of her failure. The wind howled, a hungry wolf scratching at her door. It was the first blizzard of the season, a monster of ice and fury that swallowed the world in white. Elena huddled by her meager fire, listening to the shrieking gale. It was a lonely sound, but it was familiar. It was the only voice that answered her anymore. A sudden, violent crash against the side of her hut startled her. It wasn't the wind. It was heavy, solid. A thud of dead weight that made the whole structure groan. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache of her solitude. No one ever came this far north. Not by choice. She waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Silence returned, broken only by the storm's relentless cry. Curiosity warred with fear. Whatever was out there, the blizzard would claim it before dawn. She had been left to die in this wasteland, but she wasn't sure she could do the same to another living soul. Wrapping her thin cloak tightly around her shoulders, she took a deep breath and unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the wall. A wall of white fury greeted her, snow and ice stinging her face. And there, half buried in a fresh drift, was a man. He was massive, a silhouette of impossible size against the swirling snow. He lay face down, a dark cloak dusted with white. Beside him, a shape that made her blood run cold. A wolf. It was enormous, larger than any she had ever seen, with fur the color of storm clouds. It lay still, its head resting on its paws, a faint plume of breath the only sign of life. They were both going to die. Something inside her, the healer she used to be, refused to let that happen. She waded into the snow, the wind trying to rip her from her feet. She reached the man, grabbing his shoulder. "Get up!" She screamed over the gale, her voice stolen by the storm. He didn't move. She rolled him over. His face was harsh and beautiful, all sharp angles and pale skin, framed by hair as black as a moonless night. A gash ran down his temple, blood frozen into a dark crust. He was unconscious, and he was freezing. She couldn't move him. He was too big, a man carved from mountain stone. Desperation clawed at her. She looked at the wolf. Its eyes were open now, a pale, luminous silver that seemed to glow in the gloom. They weren't the eyes of a wild animal. They were intelligent, aware. They were watching her. She expected a growl, a flash of teeth. Instead, the great beast simply watched her, its gaze heavy and ancient. It didn't seem hostile. It seemed resigned. "Help me," she whispered, not knowing if it could understand. "He'll die out here." The wolf blinked slowly. It lifted its massive head, nudged the man's shoulder with its nose, and then looked back at her, a silent question in its gaze. It was then she realized the wolf was also injured, a dark stain spreading across the fur on its flank. They were two broken things, just like her. With a surge of adrenaline, she hooked her arms under the man's shoulders and pulled. He was a dead weight, an anchor of ice and muscle. She strained, her muscles screaming, her bare hands burning from the cold. The wolf whimpered softly, a low, pained sound. It struggled to its feet, favoring its wounded side, and pressed against the man's back, adding its strength to hers. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they dragged him out of the snowdrift and through the door of her hut. The moment they were inside, she slammed the door against the storm and barred it. The wolf collapsed onto the floor, its breathing ragged. The man lay like a felled tree in the middle of her tiny home. She was a small, fragile thing next to his sheer scale. She stripped away his frozen cloak and tunic, her hands trembling. His chest was a landscape of old scars, a map of 100 battles she couldn't imagine. But it was the new wound that worried her, a deep, jagged cut on his side that looked suspiciously like it was made by a blade, not a fall. This was no lost traveler. This was a warrior. She worked numbly, her healer's instincts taking over. She cleaned his wounds with boiled snowmelt and the last of her precious herbs. His skin was like ice, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from within. As she pressed a warm cloth to his temple, he groaned, his eyelids fluttering. For a moment, his eyes opened. They were the same color as the wolf's, a startling, luminous silver. They found hers, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. It felt like he was looking past her skin and bones, directly into the hollow, aching space inside her. Then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again. She turned her attention to the wolf. It watched her approach, no fear in its gaze, only a weary trust. She gently examined its flank. The wound was deep, but clean. She cleaned it as best she could, her hands stroking the thick, soft fur. The wolf let out a low rumble, a sound that vibrated through her palms. It wasn't a growl. It was almost a purr. For 3 days, the storm raged. For 3 days, Elena tended to the man and his wolf. She fed the fire, melted snow for water, and shared her meager rations of dried meat and bread, giving most of it to the wolf, who ate it with a strange, solemn dignity. The man, Cale, as she learned from a whisper in his fevered dreams, drifted in and out of consciousness. He was trapped in a delirium, murmuring of ancient pacts and a search that had spanned centuries. He spoke of a cold that wouldn't leave him, a hollowness that no victory could fill. Elena listened while she bathed his face. She felt an unwelcome kinship with this broken stranger. He was haunted by a different kind of emptiness, but it was emptiness all the same. She, the barren woman. He, the man searching for something he could never find. "I've been looking for you," he mumbled once, his silver eyes unfocused but fixed on her face. "So long." She shushed him gently, placing a cool cloth on his forehead. "It's the fever, stranger. Rest." But the words echoed in the quiet hut, a strange and impossible warmth in the frozen world. The wolf never left his side. It lay like a sentinel, its great head resting near Cale's hand. It watched Elena with an unnerving intelligence. Sometimes, when the pain in her heart became a physical ache, the wolf would get up, limp over, and rest its heavy head on her knee. The contact was grounding, a silent offering of comfort from one wounded creature to another. She started talking to it, her voice a low murmur beneath the howl of the wind. She told it of her exile, of Ilyana's cold eyes, of the shame that had been her only blanket for so long. The wolf listened, its silver eyes never leaving her face. It felt less like talking to an animal and more like confessing to an ancient, silent god. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Sunlight, pale and thin, filtered through her one small window. And Cale woke up. His silver eyes were clear. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his gaze sweeping the hut before landing on her. There was no confusion in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving intensity. "You saved me," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble that resonated in her chest. It was not a question. Elena nodded, clutching her cup of weak tea like a shield. You and your companion. You would have frozen. He looked at the wolf, who met his gaze. A silent conversation seemed to pass between them. The wolf rose, stretched, and padded to the door, scratching at it lightly. He needs to hunt, Cale said, his eyes returning to her. You've shared what little you had. She felt a pang of loss as she unbarred the door. The great wolf paused on the threshold, turning to look at her one last time before disappearing into the blinding white of the snow-covered forest. Now she was truly alone with him. The tiny hut seemed to shrink around his presence. He was still weak, but a raw, coiled power emanated from him. It was intimidating. I am Cale, he said, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. He moved stiffly, but with a predator's economy of motion. Elena. The name felt small and plain in the face of his storm-like presence. Why are you here, Elena? He asked, his gaze missing nothing. No one lives this far north unless they are running from something, or have been thrown away. The bluntness of it stole her breath. She looked down at her hands. Thrown away. The words were bitter. I was found wanting. He was silent for a long moment. She expected pity, or perhaps disdain. Instead, his voice was soft when he spoke. I know what it is to be hollow. Her head snapped up. His silver eyes held a profound, centuries-old loneliness that she recognized instantly. It was the same emptiness she saw in her own reflection, just deeper, older, colder. It was the damage she had sensed in his fevered ramblings. In that moment, he was not an intimidating warrior. He was just a man as broken as she was. The wary circling began. They were two wounded animals in a small cage, unsure if they could trust the quiet that had fallen between them. He was recovering his strength with unnatural speed. He would chop wood for her, his movements precise and powerful, the axe splitting logs with a single, clean stroke. He never spoke of his past, and she didn't ask. The wolf, Fen, as Cale called him, returned each evening with a fresh kill, leaving a rabbit or a snow hare on her doorstep. He would then settle by the fire, a silent, watchful guardian. Intimacy grew in the spaces between words. It grew in the way he'd take the water bucket from her hands without a word when he saw her struggling. It grew in the way she'd leave a hot bowl of stew for him by the fire after he returned from a patrol of the perimeter he'd silently established. She found herself tending to his wounds long after they had begun to heal, just for the excuse to touch him. His skin was always cool, but the contact sent a jolt of warmth through her. She would trace the edges of his old scars, her fingers mapping the violent history written on his body. He would let her, his breathing deepening, his silver eyes closing as if in silent surrender. One evening, as she was replacing the bandage on his side, her fingers brushed the unmarred skin of his stomach. A tremor went through him. His hand shot out, not grabbing her, but gently encircling her wrist. His touch was cold, but it burned like frost. What do they say about you, Elena? He murmured, his voice thick. That I am barren, she whispered, the word tasting like ash, a dead end, worthless to the pack. His thumb stroked the delicate skin of her wrist. His eyes were not filled with pity. They were filled with a simmering rage that wasn't directed at her. They are fools, he stated, the words flat and absolute. They look at a winter field and call it barren, not knowing the life that sleeps beneath the snow. Her heart stuttered. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever looked at her emptiness and seen potential. You are not hollow, he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. You are waiting. I can feel it. Before she could process his words, he leaned in. He didn't kiss her. He simply rested his forehead against hers. The contact was electric. For a moment, the chaotic flashes in her mind stilled, replaced by a profound, silent calm. It was like a storm-tossed sea finding a sudden, impossible peace. "I think," he whispered, his breath a cool cloud against her lips, "that I have been searching for you for 500 years." The confession was so immense, so impossible, that her mind rejected it. He was still weak from his injury, his mind not yet clear. It was a phantom of the fever, a beautiful, cruel lie. "You should rest, Cale," she said, pulling away, her hands trembling. "You're not yourself." The hurt that flashed in his silver eyes was so real, so sharp, it was like a physical blow. He didn't argue, he simply lay back, the light in his eyes dimming, the cold returning to his features. He had offered her a glimpse of the man beneath the ice, and she had thrown a blanket over him. The distance returned, thicker than before. The easy silence was replaced by a tense one. He was polite, helpful, but the vulnerability was gone, sealed behind a wall of cold courtesy. He had been damaged by her rejection, and she was damaged by the hope she had so quickly crushed. She hated herself for it. A week passed. The snow was thick on the ground, but the world was quiet. Kyle was almost fully healed. She knew he would be leaving soon. The thought left a pit in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. One afternoon, while she was gathering firewood not far from the hut, Fen let out a low, warning growl. The wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, his silver eyes fixed on the forest path. Cale was there in an instant, appearing at her side as if from thin air. He moved in front of her, a human shield, his body tense. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a blade of ice. Then she heard it. The crunch of snow under heavy boots. The jingle of mail. 4 men emerged from the trees. They wore the dark green cloaks and wolf head emblems of her old pack's enforcers. Her blood ran cold. The man in the lead, Vorlag, was her stepmother's captain of the guard. His face was a mask of cruel satisfaction. "Elena," Vorlag sneered, "the Lady Ilyana was worried about you. Sent us to bring you home." Home. The word was a lie. Ilyana had never worried about her. This was not a rescue. It was a retrieval. She had failed to die quietly, and now her stepmother was sending men to correct that oversight. "I'm not going back," Elena said, her voice shaking but firm. Vorlag's eyes flickered to Kyle, dismissing him as some wildling trapper. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Step aside." Kyle didn't move. "This land is under my protection," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And so is she. Leave now." Vorlag laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your protection? You are 1 man. We are 4. We are taking the Baron bitch, with or without your permission." The word, Baron, hit Cale like a physical blow meant for her. A terrifying transformation began. His shoulders broadened, his features contorting. A low, guttural snarl ripped from his throat, a sound that was not human. It was the sound of 1,000 winters, of ancient, untamed power. In the space of a heartbeat, the man was gone. In his place stood a monster of myth, a beast. A wolf larger and more terrible than Fen, who now stood beside him, a loyal soldier at his general's side. Cale's shifted form was colossal, his fur the color of midnight, his eyes burning with silver fire. He was no mere wolf. He was the alpha of alphas, the primal heart of the pack. He was the king. Vorlag and his men stumbled back, their faces ashen with terror. They had heard tales of the Alpha King, a recluse for centuries, a figure of terrifying legend. They had never believed he was real. Cale, the beast, took a step forward, the ground trembling. He didn't roar. He didn't need to. His silence was more terrifying than any sound. He was a promise of swift, brutal death. Elena, frozen in a mix of terror and awe, finally moved. Her legs gave out, and she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough bark of a pine tree. The soldiers drew their swords, their hands shaking. "It's an abomination!" one of them shrieked. The king's burning silver eyes flickered to her, and for a second she saw a flash of fear. Not for himself. For her. He took another step, placing his massive body between her and the soldiers. He became her wall, her fortress of fur and fury. She did the only thing that made sense. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees and hid behind him. She pressed her face into the thick fur of his hind leg, her hands gripping him like an anchor in a hurricane. His fur was surprisingly soft. It smelled of pine and winter and cold stone. It smelled like kale. The soldiers stood frozen, their swords looking like children's toys against his sheer scale. He didn't attack. He didn't move. He just stood there, a silent mountain of rage, daring them to take another step. His presence was an absolute, unshakable veto. Elena could feel the tremors of his silent growls vibrating through her body. He was a living shield, and she was cowering in his shadow. The men who had come to drag her away were paralyzed by the sight of the legend they had mocked. Minutes stretched into an eternity. No one moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines and the ragged breathing of the terrified men. The king's beast didn't twitch a muscle. He was a statue of impending violence, and he would not move until the threat to her was gone. Finally, Vorlog broke. With a choked cry, he dropped his sword and turned, scrambling back into the forest. His men were right behind him, their flight clumsy and panicked. They vanished into the trees, leaving only their discarded sword and the lingering scent of their fear. The king didn't move. He stood, listening, his great head raised until the last sound of their retreat had faded completely. Only then did he seem to relax, the tension leaving his colossal frame in a visible wave. Elena was still huddled behind him, her face buried in his fur. He was the Alpha King, the man she had nursed, the man she had called a fevered fool, was the most powerful being in their world. And he had just used that power to shield her. He turned his massive head, his silver eyes finding her. The fire in them was banked, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. He nudged her gently with his wet nose, a silent question. "Are you all right?" Before she could answer, a shudder racked his body. A pained whine escaped his throat. He stumbled, his powerful legs buckling. He crashed to the snow-covered ground, the force of his fall shaking the earth. The shift reversed itself in a painful, convulsive ripple of bone and muscle. In moments the beast was gone, and Kyle lay naked and trembling in the snow, his face pale and beaded with sweat. The old cold, the one he'd spoken of in his fever, was back. It radiated from him in waves, frosting the snow beneath him. "Kale!" She rushed to his side, trying to cover him with her own thin cloak. His eyes were glazed with pain. "The search. It took too much," he gasped, his teeth chattering violently. "Centuries of it. It hollowed me out. The bond. Finding you. It was supposed to fix it. But using my power, it opened the wound." He was dying. The effort of the shift, of protecting her, had shattered the fragile peace he had found. The emptiness he carried was a literal, physical thing, a wound of the soul, and it was now consuming him from the inside out. His skin was turning gray, ice crystals forming in his black hair. Fen, the other wolf, whined pitifully, licking his master's face, trying to share his warmth. But it was like throwing a pebble into a frozen ocean. "No," Elena whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "No, you can't." She dragged him back to the hut, her strength born of pure panic. She piled every blanket, every scrap of fur on top of him, but the cold wasn't external. It was a glacier expanding from his heart. He was freezing from the inside out. She sat beside him, holding his icy hand, her own warmth seeming to vanish into him with no effect. His breathing grew shallow. The silver light in his eyes began to fade, leaving them dull and gray. He was leaving her, just as she had found him, just as she had realized what he was. what he was to her. The man who saw life in her barren fields was being consumed by his own. Ilyana's men were gone, but her stepmother had won. She had sent them to destroy Elena's life, and they had succeeded by destroying him instead. Despair, absolute and crushing, settled over her. She was alone again, in a silent hut, with a dying king, and the ghost of a hope she had foolishly allowed herself to feel. She rested her head on his still chest, listening to the faint, failing flutter of his heart. And she wept. She stayed like that for a day, or maybe two. Time lost its meaning. The fire died down and the hut grew cold, but she didn't notice. The only reality was the encroaching ice in the man beside her. Fen lay at the foot of the cot, a statue of grief, refusing to eat or move. In the depths of her sorrow, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst. It was a quiet, deep unlocking. The chaotic flashes she had always mistaken for madness began to coalesce. They weren't random. They had a pattern. Alone in the quiet, grieving the man who had named her worth, her power surfaced. It wasn't fire or light. It was time. She saw it, all at once. She saw Kyle as a young king, making a vow over his father's body, sealing his heart until his true mate was found. She saw him searching, century after lonely century, his hope slowly eroding, the vow turning from a promise into a curse, hollowing him out, creating the cold that was now killing him. She saw her own bloodline, a line of healers whose gift was not with herbs, but with the threads of life itself. A gift so powerful it was feared, bound, and suppressed generations ago, mistaken for barrenness. It wasn't that she couldn't create life, it was that her magic resonated with the echoes of it, past, present, and future. And she saw the bond between them, not as a simple mating call, but as a golden thread woven through time, connecting his ancient strength to her dormant power. His search had weakened him, but finding her had given the curse a focal point. Protecting her had broken the dam. Her grief transformed into a fierce, burning clarity. He had called her a winter field, sleeping. He was right, and the winter was over. She placed her hands on his chest. His skin was as cold as marble. She closed her eyes, not focusing on the cold, but on the golden thread of their bond. She didn't try to force warmth into him. That was like trying to melt a glacier with a candle. Instead, she reached through the bond, into him, with her newfound sense. She didn't try to heal his wound. She simply showed it the way home. She gathered the echoes of his past, the warmth of his mother's love, the pride in his father's eyes, the fire of his first shift, and held them against the cold. She showed his fading spirit the moments of hope during his long search, the fleeting glimpses of the mate he knew he would find. Then she showed him the present. She showed him her, the outcast, finding him in the snow. She showed him his own gentleness, the vulnerability he had shared, the way he looked at her as if she were the sunrise. She showed him the beast he had become to shield her, the sheer, absolute power of his devotion. She wasn't pushing time or changing it. She was reminding his soul of its own warmth, using the echoes of his own life as a map to guide him back from the brink. She was showing him that the hollowness wasn't the truth of him. The love was a flicker. Under her palms, a faint warmth stirred in the center of his chest. It was small, fragile, but it was there. A single ember in a frozen wasteland. "Stay," she whispered, the word a quiet command echoing the one he had given her. "I have you." She poured all of her focus, all of herself, into that ember. She wove the threads of her own timeline around it, the resilience that had kept her alive, the flicker of kindness that had made her drag a stranger from the snow, the burgeoning love for the broken man who saw her, truly saw her, their timelines, their very souls, intertwined around that spark. His power and hers, strength and sense, fusing into something new. The warmth spread, slowly, Then with gathering speed it pushed back the ice. Color returned to his skin. The frost in his hair melted. The silver light, brilliant and fierce, flooded back into his eyes as they snapped open. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand coming up to cover hers on his chest. His skin was no longer cold. It was warm, alive. "Elena," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at her, and the awe in his eyes was blinding. He didn't just see a woman who had saved him. He saw her power. He saw her. You were right," she said, a smile finally breaking through her tear-streaked face. "I was just sleeping." He pulled her down to him, his arms wrapping around her, holding her with a desperate strength. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the dampness of his own tears. They were alive. They were whole. They were together. The reunion was not one of grand words, but of quiet, profound truth. They held each other as the sun rose, the golden light filling the small hut. He looked at her, his silver eyes full of a love that was ancient and brand new all at once. He saw the queen that had been hidden inside the outcast, and she, looking at him, no longer saw a king or a beast, but the man who had been her other half across centuries. "My stepmother," Elena said, her voice hard with a new strength. "She will not stop." Cale's expression turned to granite. "No," he agreed. "She won't." He rose from the bed, no longer a broken man, but a king, restored. His power rolled off him in palpable waves, but it was different now. It was no longer cold and lonely. It was tempered by the warmth of her magic, anchored by their bond. "She wanted to throw you away. Instead, she has given the North its queen." They did not wait for Ilyana to send more men. They went to her. They walked out of the wilderness hand in hand, with Fen pacing silently at their side. News of the king's return and of his chosen mate spread like wildfire. Packs that had grown complacent under the rule of distant, squabbling lords suddenly remembered their true allegiance. Wolves and shifters emerged from the forests and mountains, drawn by the call of their restored alpha. By the time they reached the fortress of her old pack, a small army marched behind them. Ilyana met them in the great hall, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. She stood before the Alpha's throne, a place she had coveted for years, surrounded by Vorlag and her loyal guards. "You!" she screeched, her eyes locking on Elena. "Baron traitor, what witchcraft is this?" "It's not witchcraft, stepmother," Elena said, her voice clear and ringing in the silent hall. "It is the truth you tried to bury." Cale stepped forward, his presence silencing every breath in the room. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Ilyana of the Stone River Pack," he declared, his voice resonating with the authority of ages. "You stand accused of the exile and attempted murder of your queen." "She is no queen," Ilyana spat. "She is a defective, worthless." "I was addressing my future queen," Cale cut in, his voice dropping to a lethal calm as he turned to Elena. "My love, what is your judgment?" All eyes turned to her. The pack members who had once mocked her, the elders who had sanctioned her exile, her stepmother who had condemned her. They were all waiting. Elena looked at Ilyana, at the woman whose cruelty had defined her life. She felt the rage, the grief, the years of pain, but she also felt the quiet strength of the bond with Cale, the hum of her own power. She could have demanded death. She could have taken revenge. Instead, she looked past her stepmother, at the faces of the pack. She saw their fear, their confusion. "My judgment," Elena said, her voice steady, "is that this pack has been poisoned by the belief that worth is measured only in bloodlines and heirs. It has made you value power over kindness, legacy over loyalty." She met Ilyana's hateful gaze. "You will not be killed. Death is an ending. You will have a new beginning, just as I did." She turned to Kyle. "She is to be stripped of her name and status. She will live as an Omega, serving the lowest of this pack. She will learn the worth of those she once deemed worthless. She will learn it every day, for the rest of her life. A murmur went through the hall. It was a fate worse than death. A life of the same invisibility and shame she had forced upon Elena. Justice, cold and perfect. Ilyana's face crumpled in horror. Vorlog made a desperate move for his sword, but Fen was on him in a flash, the wolf's teeth at his throat, ending the rebellion before it began. Kale looked at Elena, his silver eyes filled with pride and love. "As the queen commands," he said, his voice booming through the hall. The pack fell to their knees as one. Weeks later, the northern wilderness was no longer a place of exile. It was the heart of the kingdom. The king's fortress was being restored, but he and Elena still preferred the quiet of her small hut. One morning, she woke wrapped in his arms, the early sun casting long shadows through the pines. The air was crisp and cold, but she had never felt so warm. Kyle was watching her, a soft smile on his face. "What are you thinking about?" she murmured, tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "that my 500-year search was a short price to pay." He kissed her forehead. "And that this winter field is the most beautiful garden I have ever seen." She smiled, pressing her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. The ghosts of children she would never have were gone, replaced by the solid, living warmth of the man beside her, and the promise of a future they would build together. The north was vast and wild, and threats still lingered on the edges of their lands, but for the first time in her life, Elena was not afraid. She was home. She was loved. She was whole.